What's happening, Boot Junkies? Mike Delgadio here, back with another video on home studio setup for VoiceOver. Not in the booth today. I got a new table to put my computer and junk on, so I ended up disconnecting everything in my studio. And so I was going to hook it all back together, and I thought, what better time than to show maybe people who are new to VoiceOver and new to setting up a desk, all the different things and bits and bobs and wires that you need in order to hook up everything in your studio. Now I'm going to make it like this is going to be a desktop studio. I'm not going to involve the booth in this one. This is going to be just like what a first time setup might be. You'll also note this is untreated space at the moment. I'm going to paint the walls, and so all my acoustic treatment's down. So I'm just going to really concentrate on hooking up everything here on the desk. So starting from a perfectly clean slate, I'll walk you through all the different things that I'm going to hook up and attach to the computer. The first thing that we're going to hook up is the interface. Now, my interface is an Audient ID22, and that's this piece of equipment right here. This is sort of the brains of the operation. The interface is where you connect your microphone to the computer, and it's got knobs and buttons in here that control the gain on the microphone, how loud the microphone will be, and whether or not it supplies phantom power. Yours may look different than this one. Yours may have buttons on the front, it may have buttons on the side, it may have buttons in software. They're all a little bit different, but they all do essentially the same things. So this is the first thing that we need to do, and we'll hook this up to the computer. Depending on your interface, it may be powered over USB, or it may be powered directly with power with a wall wart. So you'll need to look into your manual about how it connects. And then you'll connect the USB to the computer. Once you have it connected, it should show up as a sound card on the computer. So if you have an Audient or a PreSonus or a Focusrite, it should show up as a sound card. After you've connected your interface to the computer, the next thing we'll hook up is the microphone. Now, most microphones that you're connecting to an interface are going to get connected with an XLR cable. An XLR cable has two ends, male and female, and it's got typically it's these 3-pin connectors. This is definitely the kind of cable you're going to need if you're using a condenser microphone that requires phantom power. You don't want this kind of connector because this connector won't carry phantom power, and you certainly don't want one that's headphone sized. Phantom power, you're going to really want to go over this XLR type cable. This will just plug one into input 1 of your interface if it has more than one, or any one that you choose. So in this case, I've got input 1 and 2, and I can just connect right to that. So this one will then go to the microphone. So I've got my microphone right here, and this one is the Gage ECM87. So we've got a condenser style microphone, and we have the shock mount. Depending on the microphone you buy, it may have a shock mount, it may not. Sometimes there'll be a pressure fit shock mount where the microphone just fits in and it squeezes it to hold it in place. Others will screw onto the bottom. It all depends on which microphone you have. The shock mount will typically have a threaded connector on the back, and they're fairly universal. There are two different sizes. There's a large size that connects to a microphone stand, and then there's a smaller size that will connect to something like a scissor mount. And if you have a scissor mount with a small connector, they make adapters so you can thread them into the large size to go to the small size. So we're just going to use, in this case, a nice small desk type microphone stand that we'll just put on the desk here. A lot of microphones can be fairly heavy, so if you find that it's too heavy or the microphone makes your mic stand tip over, or if you have a boom arm that attaches to the microphone stand and makes it tip over, one trick that you can do is you can find these ankle weights. A lot of times you can find these at Goodwill, at secondhand stores, for people that have given up on their New Year's resolutions. You can just slide these over the stand, and it makes them a lot more stable. Most microphone stands, they have a swivel in the middle. That's an adjustment that allows you to adjust the height. And so you just spin it until it's tight, and then it won't move. Then connect the female end to the bottom of the microphone, and it will only fit one way. And it should click in. If you're, sometimes the XLR will have a little button on it that will lock it into place, so you can lock it. The next thing you're going to need is you're going to need a pair of headphones. One so that you can hear yourself, you can hear something that's playing back, and they should be over ear or on ear so that they don't leak much sound, so that sound coming out of your earphones won't end up back into the microphone. There are two that I recommend. My personal favorites are the Sennheiser, either the HD 280 Pro or the HD 380 Pro. The HD 280 Pro, very common. They sound great. I like them for their comfort. They fit over the ear, all the way around the ear, so that you can wear them for a long time. They're also very well insulated, and they do block a great deal of sound. There's the 280s. There's the 280s and the HD 380s. I often keep my 280s here at my control desk, and I keep 380s in the booth. The reason I typically use 380s, and you'll see the HD 380 Pros in almost all of my videos, is I really like them because the cord can be replaced. It just disconnects and you can replace it. So this cable is not the one that came with these headphones. I have a short one that's just the right length. Whereas the 280s have this long coiled cable that can just tend to get in the way. Sometimes it rubs against my zipper. Sometimes it gets in the way, so I don't always like to use it. Another really good option for headphones is the Sony MDR7506s. These are excellent sounding. You'll see them everywhere. I find personally that these are far less comfortable for me. One, they're on ear, so they have to clamp very tightly to reduce the leak. And for me, I find the sound of these less pleasant to listen to for a long period. They tend to be much more detailed. They have a very crystal clear high end that after you get used to these can make every other headphone sound dull. They are really super clear, but I do find them to be uncomfortable for long wear. I don't like things actually touching my ear. I want it to go around my ear and clamp my head, not clamp my ear, because my ears will get sore. And the 7506s tend to make my ears sore. That's just me. But for $100, you absolutely cannot go wrong with 7506s. They also have a 10-foot cord, a little bit of a bummer. Somewhere on your interface, there's going to be a headphone jack, and it's probably going to be a 1/4 inch. So if you have a, what do they call that, a 3/8 inch, 3.5 millimeter, I forget, the small size, like the phone size headphone jack, you're going to need to put on an adapter. And most of your premium monitors will have, it screws on so it doesn't accidentally get lost. And you just take that and you plug it into the headphone jack. So you just plug that in there, and now you'll be able to listen to what's going through the microphone, and you'll be able to hear playback. Depending on how your desk is set up, sometimes that's really long and you don't want that cable on your desk. So one thing you can do, one thing I do, is, and since my headphone jack is on the back of the interface, I actually have it go out the back and come under my desk. And so I just use a long, really durable extension cable that's sort of permanent. And I have the jack actually come out the front of my desk. So you can use an extension cord if you have to. It's just a stereo. Since your headphones are always going to be at your desk, you'll probably want a headphone stand. And I just use one of these super cheap, really basic ones that just clamps onto the desk. Some people like to have them on their desk. I like to have them out of the way when I'm not using them. So I actually just attach it and hang my headphones right off the end of my desk. So they just sit there like that, out of the way when they're not in use. So now we can listen to ourselves over headphones. But the last part that you may want to add is you'll probably want to add a pair of stereo monitors, or at least one for voiceover but generally two, because you may also be listening to a stereo signal. So you'll want to have monitors. Now these are different than speakers in that monitors are optimized to sound neutral. They're trying to give you a detail of what it actually sounds like rather than being hyped for bass or hyped for treble or anything like that. They try and give you a true representation of the sound. Even though studio monitors, they all sound different depending on how big they are, they do try and give you a very accurate representation of what you've recorded. They're very detailed, so that way you can hear if there's any imperfections, anything that you need to redeliver. And so you might need a monitor. Something like this is a really good monitor to use if you're starting out. These are the JBL's LSR 305s. They're bigger than your typical desktop speakers, but they're really true sounding. Not very heavy on bass because it's got a little tiny woofer on there. But these are real common, and you can put these on your desk. They're not too heavy. But because you're putting a heavy speaker on your desk, it could actually make your desk vibrate and add unwanted vibrations, and they'll be pointed not at your ear. So you can also get these little foam monitor stands that allow you to angle and adjust how these monitors point at your ear. And they also acoustically decouple the speaker from the desk so they don't make your desk vibrate, add unwanted vibrations to your desk. Can reduce the coloration of the sound a little bit. I mostly just use them so that I can angle that tweeter up at my eye, up towards eye level. And it just sits on there. I'll show you in a second. On the back of the monitor, you'll see that it's got a different kind of connector than you might be used to for a speaker. There's power requirement. So each monitor will have its own power. There's an amplifier built into this. It will usually have a knob or two to adjust the gain, how loud they will be. The maximum, what you're doing is you're actually setting the maximum volume. It's usually a set and forget. And then there'll be two different kind of connectors. You can either use an XLR style connector or a tip ring sleeve. And then there may be some switches on whether or not you want it to be bass boosted or treble boosted to try and account for differences in your room. And these are generally set and forget because they're on the back. The monitors get attached. The way I typically attach them, they can be XLR, they can be 1/4 inch. I usually use a 1/4 inch to XLR connector. So the 1/4 inch plugs into the interface, the XLR plugs into the back of the monitor. On your interface, there will generally be jacks that will say out. They may say mon, they may say out, they may say left and right, but you just generally plug them in. And that'll be connected. Now we're going to plug it into power next. So the monitors themselves, they should have usually they have an LED, an indicator of some sort that indicates that they're on. You can leave them on all the time. I generally leave mine plugged in and on all the time, but if you're energy conscious, you can turn them off in the back. As far as positioning these, they should form an equilateral triangle with one point of the triangle being essentially the back of your head and then 60 degrees out to each one, and they should all be the same distance apart. Same distance from speaker to speaker and from speaker to ear as best you can. A good rule of thumb to know if you're close to having it set up correctly is you measure the distance between the two fronts of the speakers, and then sit in front of them. And as you look at the speaker, if all you can see is the front of the speaker and you can't see its edges, then you know you're centered properly. So now I have those set so that all I can do is I can only see the front when I'm in my typical sitting position. Your interface should generally have two different outputs so that you can run the headphone jack and the monitors simultaneously, or you can switch between the two. So they should have independently controlled volumes. And generally, whenever you're recording, you'll turn your monitor speakers all the way down and you'll control your headphone adjustment. To familiarize yourself with your interface, there are some knobs and buttons that are pretty common to all of them. You should find one for the monitor volume. You should find one for the headphone volume. And then there will be a separate knob or slider for the gain of the microphone. And that's different than how loud it is on the output. The gain is how loud it is on the input. And generally, you turn that preamp up as high as you need to get a good waveform without clipping. Clipping means that you're so loud that you overload what gets saved on disk, so that the waveform gets cut off at the top. For most, it's all going to depend on your interface, but for most basic prosumer interfaces that I've come in contact with, you'll probably start with your gain knob about three quarters of the way, all the way turned up is generally a good place to start. And then if you're speaking and it's too loud, you find that the waveform goes all the way off the top in your DAW, then it's too loud and you'll back it down a bit. Generally, you want to elevate your voice nice and loud. And if you see that the waveform goes all the way off the top of the track, then it's up too loud and you can back it down a bit. It really depends on how sensitive your microphone is, what kind of microphone you have. A Shure SM7B, a very insensitive microphone, you might have to turn that all the way up. Other microphones, you may have to back it down a bit. The next thing you might need is something like a FET head. A FET head is used for certain microphones, like a dynamic microphone, if the interface cannot provide enough gain to get a usable signal out of it. So you may have a microphone like this, a dynamic microphone, instead of a condenser microphone. And these usually require a lot more gain. They require the knob on your preamp to be turned all the way up. And that can often make the signal sound hissy. There'll be a lot of underlying noise because the preamp is working really hard and it's not working as efficiently as it normally would by having it turned all the way up. So if that's the case, you may need to use something like a FET head or a cloud lifter. And all this is a preamplifier or an inline amplifier. This little doodad right here is a FET head. A cloud lifter is a little box. They work and hook up exactly the same way. And what this does is this uses the phantom power from your interface and it powers some circuitry in here that will make that microphone sound louder. If you're using something like a cloud lifter, you'll definitely need to use something like a little pigtail. This could be 6 inches like this one. It could be 25 feet, but you'll need an extra cable to connect from the mic, from between the interface and the microphone. So in this case, we will plug the FET head into one end of the cable. Clicks into place. And I'll just plug it in line near the back of the interface. So that is set and forget. You just leave it there, and then you just plug your microphone, plug your cable into the microphone. Now, if you use something like a FET head or a cloud lifter, you'll need to turn on phantom power on your interface for that particular microphone. So on mine, it's a switch. Yours may be a push button, maybe labeled phantom power, maybe labeled plus 48V. And that uses power. Now, the FET head and the cloud lifter block phantom power. They receive it, and then it doesn't make it any further down the line. So even though we're using a dynamic microphone that does not use phantom power, it's still on your interface, but that device is using it as its power source and not sending that down the line. So the microphone still is not receiving phantom power, so there's no risk of damaging it. When you plug that FET head or cloud lifter in, you will turn your gain down probably. It will probably be too loud if it's more than 3/4 of the way up. I do find I can turn this down to about the between 50 and 60% of maximum signal, and that usually works. Now, if you're a streamer, you may still need to use a gate or a compressor, but you won't necessarily be able to use them in software because it may introduce lag or latency or overhead on your computer. And so you may need to get a hardware processor. A very common one, very, very popular one, and an excellent one is the DBX286S. This takes your most common vocal effects and turns them into a piece of hardware rather than taxing your computer to do this, and it happens in real time. It will have a noise gate, it will have a compressor, and it can both reduce the amount of hiss and even out your signal so that the difference between the loudest and the quietest parts is not so great. So these are used in between the microphone and the interface. They will have an input and an output that allow you to connect it to the interface in line. If you're going to use one of these, you should look for an interface that has sends and returns or sends and receives on it rather than having just a preamp. So in my case, in the case of the Audient ID22, there is a send and return for each channel. And so a send and return, you can actually, if you're using a send, you can have a signal come in the interface, get sent to another piece of hardware. That hardware does whatever it does to it and then returns the signal back into the return. Or if you're using something that includes a preamplifier in it, your microphone can be plugged in here and then just return signal to the interface. Depending on the hardware and how the output looks, you may need to either have a cable that's got dual tip ring sleeve, dual 1/4-inch jacks, or one that's a 1/4-inch to XLR. All depends on what kind of hardware you're using, and you can look at the manual and what the output looks like. I have a preamplifier that takes this kind, and the DBX286, the output is a 1/4-inch jack, and the return on the Audient is a 1/4-inch jack. So you can plug this from the output and put the other end in the return on the interface. And now the microphone XLR will go into the input. If you buy a 286S, you won't need a cloud lifter, or you won't need a FET head, because this will provide ample power to power something like a Shure SM7B. So you should not need to buy both a FET head or cloud lifter and a DBX286S. This sort of has the strength of a FET head built into it, or the strength of a cloud lifter built into it. So now we have the microphone going into the voice processor, the hardware processor. This is going to take care of all of our effects. Then that sends that signal, that processed signal, into the interface, which converts it from an analog signal to a digital signal and sends it along its way. Sorry about that. Sorry for the change in continuity. I completely bricked on the ending and I totally messed it up. So I'm here editing, and I was like, I'm going to try and redo that ending because I just didn't do the last version right. Sorry for that. So it looks a little bit different. You can see I've got everything all set up now on my desk. But now that we've gotten all of the equipment hooked up, we've got the hardware processor in place if we're using it, we've got our interface all hooked up, we've got our microphone hooked up to the computer. The last step is to make sure that the DAW itself can actually receive the audio. So that's the last thing that we're going to do. We'll make sure that the microphone is on, we'll make sure that the interface is hooked up, and we'll make sure that the DAW can see it. So let's switch over to the screen and I'll show you the DAW that I use, which is called Reaper, and I'll show you sort of where the settings are. If you're using a different DAW, it may be a little different, but pretty much all the DAWs hook into the sound card in the same way. So the menus might be in different places, but it should work about the same. So let's take a look. So my version of Reaper will probably look a little bit different from yours. I have a playlist called Reaper for VoiceOver where I go through all the different configurations and settings. And I encourage you after this video, if you haven't watched that playlist, to go through and make sure that you have Reaper set up and configured so that it works really well for VoiceOver. But the long and short of what we're doing is we're making sure that the DAW, that the computer itself and the recording software can see the interface. So in Reaper, in the title bar, whether you're on Mac or Windows, you should see this information about the way it's coming into the computer, so the bitrate and so forth. And you can go to Audio Device Settings, and that will bring up the Reaper Preferences window that goes right to the device. Now, if you're on a Mac, you can also get there via Reaper Preferences, and that brings up the same menu, and then you can find it in the Audio Device, and that's where you will check. Now, if you're on Windows, you'll probably want to use ASIO for All to improve the way the DAW talks to the interface and can reduce your latency. I don't have that on the Mac, but there are lots of tutorials, and I'll link to one. This is one that I found, Reaper, a tutorial for Reaper that is called ASIO for All Setup, Latency Monitoring, and Buffer Settings. That will go through how to configure ASIO to make sure that it can connect to your interface. But once you're in there, this window will look a little bit different if you're on Windows, but essentially the process is the same. You make sure that you switch the audio device itself from whatever the built-in sound card is to your interface. So in my case, mine is an Audient ID22. On Windows, it will say ASIO for All here, and then within that, there'll be some selections where you actually choose the interface by its name. So the interface looks a little bit different on Windows than it does on Mac, but the process is the same. You need to make sure that Reaper knows about the interface. And then you can click OK. Once that window's gone, you then can double click on the left-hand pane where the tracks go, and there will be a selector that shows you all of the different inputs for your device. And then we arm it with the red button, and we should start to see, as I pull that Shure SM7B close, we should see that the meter moves with my voice. And if I click record, I can start to see that waveform forming across the screen, and I can start to dial in how that looks. So if I increase the gain, I'm turning up the gain, you can see that the waveform gets larger to the point where it clips. Sorry about that. And if I turn it down, it gets quieter. All I'm doing is changing the gain setting on the interface itself. And I try and look to my waveform is one that I can see but doesn't get close to the edges of the little swim lane there. And now I can go back and see all of my recording. You can see where it clipped. We can see where it looks okay. And we now can see that waveform. This meter will tell us how close we are to the top, and if that light turns red, that means that we have clipped. So if I turn the preamp up again until it gets too loud, we'll see that that light turns red, and that means that I have clipped. I have exceeded the waveform, what the waveform can get stored on disk. I've clipped. I've exceeded what the full scale volume is. So that's the essential settings of it. Now, from here, I'm not going to go into all of the DAW settings here, but what you can do from here is you can go over to the Reaper for VoiceOver playlist that I have on YouTube, and that will walk you through how to set up Reaper, all the different configuration things so that you can have it optimized for VoiceOver, so that you can make sure that you have backups in place, so and everything. So if you're looking to become a voice actor, I'll tell you exactly everything you need to do to change Reaper so that it can be really optimized away from music production and into voice production. Does that help? I hope it does. It was beneficial for me to go through and make sure that I have everything configured here on my desk, and this is what your typical first studio might look like. From here, I'd need to acoustically treat the walls and make sure that I experiment with my microphone placement so that I can get the best possible sound. But now we've got all the electronics, we've got all of the hardware hooked up, whether we needed the voice processor, whether we needed something like a Fed head or a cloud lifter, and we have our interface, all of our cables, we've got everything all set up. So I really do. I hope that helps. I hope you found it beneficial. And that's all I have for you today. So go get your equipment all hooked up. Maybe buy whatever you need to buy if you need to buy it. Sorry, there's stuff you got to buy. But go out and get the things you need. But I encourage you to get something set up so that you can get out there and you can record something amazing. Thanks. We'll talk to you next time.